Is anything truly random?
This notion that people have that God directly commands for a leaf to fall. Of course, you're not going to move your finger. Nothing's going to happen in the world without the powering of God. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about relationship. We're talking about direct engagement. That is not one and the same.
He's not indifferent to anything. And that's what we mean by infinite. Infinitely big is only half the story. He's also infinitely tiny and detailed. A leaf moving from one place to another, God does that because it's his job. But what happens to a person, God does that because it's his relationship. So yeah, there's a difference. But when God does his job, he does it meticulously too.
Okay, everyone, this is an incredibly rare and special episode of JTV, where we are joined by two really special rabbis, two remarkable thinkers, Rabbi Manis Friedman and Rabbi Joseph Dwek. Rabbi Friedman joining us from America and Rabbi Dwek from Israel. And the reason why I've wanted to have this discussion for a while, and the reason why I wanted to bring both these rabbis together, and I'll tell you a bit about who they are in a moment in case you're not familiar, is because I noticed there is something really interesting, a bit of a difference in approach between both the rabbis from what I could see listening to both of them on two really important topics in Judaism. The first is the question of how we understand what happens in the world around us. Is anything truly random? And I've heard differing perspectives from Rabbi Friedman and Rabbi Dwek on this. What do I mean by that? When something happens to us in our lives and the world around us, can we ever see something as coincidence? How do we look at it? As an opportunity, a setback? Is it just chance, or is it all guided? Is every single detail part of the world and life divine providence, or is there room within creation for randomness and natural processes to unfold? That's point number one. Topic number two is how we speak about God himself. The Torah uses human language, God's hand, God's anger, God's remembering, but what do those words actually mean? Are they just metaphors to help us relate, or do they tell us something real, however limited, about God? And these are not just abstract questions, they shape how we see meaning in our lives and how we relate to the divine. And so I think this will be a fascinating discussion. If you're not familiar with either of these rabbis, Rabbi Joseph Dwek was the senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community of the UK. He was educated under former Sephardi chief rabbi, the great Ovadia Yosef, and is now in Israel as Rosh Bet Midrash of the Chabura, brilliant learning community. And as you will all know as well, I'm sure many of you will know Rabbi Manis Friedman, YouTube's most popular rabbi. I still think you claim that title, Rabbi. He's author, counselor, highly sought after speaker. And what we'll do is we'll take each topic in turn, first hearing each of your perspective, then allowing a direct exchange between both of you, and finally exploring what this all means in practice. So let's start off with the first topic. Is anything truly random? When something unexpected happens, is that always guided from above? Can there be such a thing as coincidence? This is the question of divine providence. What does it really mean? Does God act directly in every single detail of existence, or is there space for randomness and natural processes? Rabbi Dwek, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here and certainly to share a conversation with Rabbi Friedman. Well, I will say, first of all, that the question as you're posing it, right, when you say truly random, is a bit tricky, because recognizing the reality of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, of God, you never have anything that is truly outside of him, right, outside of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. So everything is always powered by Hakadosh Baruch Hu. I think that perhaps what some people mean with regards to that is, as you said, is he kind of engaged in every last detail in terms of a guiding essence in all of our lives? And even that, it's a matter of defining terms, right? What do we mean when we say that? What are we expecting when we say that? So, I will say at the onset that, for me, whenever it is that I speak about this, when I think about this, when I learn about this, the Rambam is my North Star, right? He is essentially the guiding Rav in terms of how it is that I've always, learned this and engaged with it. And I think the way to present it is, or one way that I would present it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu God in the Torah, the God of Israel, is a God that is interested in relationship, that the very act of creation is an act of sharing existence, of sharing being. It is an interest in relationship. But being that it's coming from God, and it is essentially coming from a place of perfection, for lack of a better term, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not interested in cheap, empty relationships. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is interested in real relationships. And so you see that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he enters into covenant no less than 10 times in the Torah, both on broad levels and on personal levels. And that's pretty remarkable, because to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu enters into covenant means that he is, in a sense, choosing to abide by rules. Right? I mean, if you're agreeing to a covenant, you're agreeing to certain parameters, and that you're going to behave in certain ways, so to speak, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is, God is utterly sovereign and free, chooses to engage in the confines of covenant for the sake of relationship. So relationship is central to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and certainly in terms of how it is that Klal Yisrael, that the Jewish people, have lived, whatever it is that anyone considers the historicity to be of the covenant. There's absolutely no question about the fact that the covenant between Israel and God has been the cornerstone of our people for 4 millennia, if you start from Avraham Avinu. So recognizing that relationship is valuable, and it needs to be meaningful and serious, and that means that there is two sides to a relationship, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu over and over again, it says in the Torah, and it says, and Chazal say, right, the language of Chazal is Rachamana Libabai, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is interested in the heart. He's interested in our connection, our dedication, our involvement in the relationship. And there is always a certain engagement that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with us. The relationship is looked at on different levels. Is God a parent to us? Is God a spouse or a partner to us? Both levels are spoken about in Tanakh and in Chazal, right, amongst the Chachamim, the Talmud and the Midrash and so on. So it all, depends on what level we're looking at it. But, so on a parental relationship, parenting, depending on the age and the level of a child, might very well be unilateral, right? Take care of the child doesn't know better, be there to support and guide and so on and so forth. But ultimately, there's an interest expressed in Torah, in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beckoning and inviting us to be able to engage in a more mature relationship with him, right? Which is why, it really begins at puberty, at bar or bat mitzvah, when a boy or a girl are beginning to actually think in terms of individuality and relationship with other, and to be able to see how it is that they might actually form connections and partnerships in the world. So there are levels of relationship. It's not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in deep intimacy with all people at all times. And the reason for that is because a relationship's value is in the two sides of the relationship. And if one side of the relationship, essentially the human side of the relationship, is not terribly engaged or indifferent, well, then there is a mode of indifference in the space of that relationship. So we hear HaKadosh Baruch Hu say in Vaikra, "Im halachtem imi bekeri," if you walk with me indifferently, haphazardly, af ani elech imachem bekeri. Well, I can do that too. You'll experience what it is to be in a world, right, and where there is indifference, and it feels like the world isn't quite responding to you or in care of you. Now, even that is important and interesting, because it's a response in a relationship, right? It's God saying, I can do that too. But that in and of itself is a relationship-oriented thing.
And
right?
can I ask,
So
Rabbi, does that mean you're saying it's God will operate in a way where actually there is no purpose behind some, I've heard a different approach that says every single thing that happens in the universe, the way a leaf falls to the ground has divine meaning. But you're saying no, that God can operate in a way in which there's just it's just randomness because that's the way we react to him.
I think we have to be very, very careful with throwing terms around, right? To talk about something as being, without purpose is very problematic, right? Hakadosh Baruch, like we say every single day in the Tefillah, Atzat Hashem hitaku, right? The desire of Hakadosh Baruch Hu is going to come out. So that means that the world is always moving from the powering and direction of God, right? That I don't think that there's a question about it. I would certainly disagree with any assertion to the contrary. The question is my personal life. Am I living in intimacy with God, or is there some level of distance between me and God? And if there is a possibility that there might be a distance between a human being and God, what is the nature of that space? What is the experience of being somewhat removed from God? And that experience is essentially an experience of indifference, for lack of a better term. Right? What does it mean, indifference? That it makes no difference. Right? In other words, it's an experience of, look, God's world may be going where it is that God wants the world to go, but am I registering as part of that? And is his attention, kaviyachol, right, so to speak, on me directly, or am I just part of the flow of life and where it is that things are going? Right? So these are subtleties, there are complexities, there are contextual elements to it that are important to take into account. So I think we always have to be careful to speak in broad general terms with things that have to do with quite individual and complex elements, if that's
And
fair. But
for sure, for sure. And just before I turn to Rabbi Friedman, so it seems that you're saying that there's degrees of providence and interaction. Would you say that they're at the least degree of providence and interaction, that there will be things that, of course, are powered by God, but that let's say go back to the tree example, the way the leaf falls, it goes one way or another way, it wouldn't really make a difference, doesn't really matter to the grand scheme of things.
When you talk about a leaf falling, right, I do think that there's, this notion that people have that God kind of, directly that commands for a leaf to fall, right? There's a Gemara that people like to quote that says that a blade of grass does not grow without either a malach whipping it, telling it to grow, or a person doesn't move their finger without a Kadosh Baruch Hu decreeing that. So I think it's very important to understand the context in which those things are said, right? The thing about moving the finger is a sugya in the Talmud that talks about witchcraft and magic, which implies that there are other sources for things to occur in the world other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Other than God, chas v'shalom. And essentially what that's saying is, of course, you're not going to move your finger. Nothing's going to happen in the world without the powering of God. The only source for anything to ever occur, or be, for that matter, in the entire universe is God. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about relationship. We're talking about direct engagement. And that is not one and the same.
Interesting. Rabbi Friedman, what's your perspective on this topic?
Well, I'm afraid this program is not going to be so exciting because we don't disagree much.
Great. Well, by the way, it may well be that I've maybe exaggerated in my own mind when listening to both your classes, the differences. Maybe they were more exaggerated, and this is, in that sense, it'd be great to reconcile all these ideas.
Definitely subtle. So this idea that a leaf moves by divine plan is really a chiddush. It's an innovative thought coming from the Baal Shem Tov. One of the things that the Baal Shem Tov was famous for was his, let's say, original take on divine providence. Everybody knew that there was hashgacha, but the hashgacha prati, that providence is very specific. This was something the Baal Shem Tov taught. The Medrash says that in the oceans, when a fish swallows another fish, it is by divine plan. Which fish is going to swallow which fish? Why would God get involved in such details? The simple answer is because if he didn't, it wouldn't happen. There is no mover or shaker other than God. So there is no cause other than God. So if he doesn't make it happen, it won't happen. It can't happen, including magic. The question is, what is, like the rabbi is saying, what is Hashem's interest in that little event? How interested is God in which fish swallows which fish? Oh, that's a very good question. In fact, in Hasidus, the definition of unholy is that which God creates without personal interest. If you create something without personal interest, that's a little bit of unholiness. That which is created without God's passion, let's say, is not as godly as that in which God invests passion or interest. And that's called a klippa, the shell around the fruit. It's there for a reason, but the reason is not personal to God. So, of course, God's interest and desire for, let's say, a human being is much greater than his desire for the fish, and certainly greater than the desire of the movement of a leaf. But the movement of the leaf can only happen because he decrees it. And he decrees it because it can contribute to some way to what the human being is going to do in the covenant and in the relationship which he does desire. So anything that he does as a means to an end is called unholy. Not because he's not making it happen, but because he's not investing any personal interest. So the reason we believe that everything must be orchestrated by God is because there is no other God to attribute it to. So if the leaf moves, who's causing it? If you don't believe in God, you say nature is causing it. The wind blew the leaf, as if the wind has some authority or some independent will to make things happen. Of course, that's not true. Nature doesn't have laws. Nature obeys laws. God says for oil to burn, it burns. God says for vinegar to burn, the vinegar burns. I think that's a very important insight. There are no laws of nature. There are the laws that nature obeys. So what we call nature is simply the observation of consistent obedience to God's command. So anything God commands consistently, we call nature. If God commands something unusual, we call it a miracle. But essentially, it's all miracles, because nothing can happen by itself. So the legal term, act of God, in the insurance company, it's an act of God. Well, what isn't? Everything is an act of God. The question is it the end and purpose, or is it a means that gets us to the end and purpose? So, yeah, there's a difference in God's relationship with divine providence.
Hey, I really hope you're enjoying the video. Just wanted to quickly say, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, like our videos, comment, and hype our videos. All these things really help us to get into the algorithm, grow the channel, and grow our impact. Thank you so much. And in our own life, and I'll come back to Rabbi Dwek in a second for your reaction to this, but just to follow up on that, for clearly what you're saying is there's much more an investment. It may all be powered by God, but there's much more an investment by God in what's happening among human beings, among the Jewish people. But should we treat everything that happens in our own lives as human beings? Should we treat all of that and everything that happens as something that God is deeply invested in? It's there for a purpose, for a reason, and look at it in that sense? Or do we need to be a bit more, make distinctions?
Does God know what is happening to me? Does God know when I'm comfortable or uncomfortable? Is he aware? Is he conscious? Oh, of course. That awareness alone causes things to happen because he's not indifferent to anything. And that's what we mean by infinite. Infinitely big is only half the story. He's also infinitely tiny and detailed. So Rambam and others write, there's a difference between the hashgacha to human beings and particularly to Jews. It doesn't mean that on some things there is no hashgacha. It means how interested, how personal is this? So, for example, a leaf moving from one place to another, God does that because it's his job. But what happens to a person, God does that because it's his relationship. So, yeah, there's a difference. But when God does his job, he does it meticulously too. So he leaves nothing out in his job, and that's why ein od milvado. There is no other cause, another mover or shaker. There's only him.
Rabbi Dwek wants to follow up on some of the things Rabbi Friedman said. What are your reflections?
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly don't disagree with anything that Rabbi Friedman said. Who am I? Who am I to disagree? I think, if anything, perhaps it would be putting some fine points on perhaps terms and things, right? So, I mean, in my years of teaching and sharing with people, I notice how people relate to terms like God makes things happen. We tend as human beings to relate to that in a very mechanical way, right? So when I say I make something happen, I'm kind of doing things. There are steps and corollaries or reactions that ultimately create. And in a very rudimentary sense, that's not untrue. But as it says in Yeshaya, Lo machshavotay machshavotechem, lo darkechem drachai. Right? Kadosh Baruch Hu says through the Navi, my thinking is not your thinking, my ways are not your ways. I don't do things like you. So when I say to you, I make X or I do X, it is never the way that you do it. Right? It's not mechanical. Right? We don't know how it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, causes a leaf to blow in the wind, or the wind to blow for that matter, or for all of, as the Rav was saying, right? All of the laws that nature obeys. It's not as we might do it. So I just do think that it's important for us to underline that, because we tend to think that God does things that way, and it does get us into a bit of a knots sometimes in terms of how it is that we think and relate. And the difference between, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, it's things being his job or things being his care or his interest, right? As the Rav was saying. Also, I mean, Hakadosh Baruch Hu's job, quote unquote, right, is creation, right? Is powering Maaseh Bereshit and bringing it to its end. And there is an end, right? Koreh hadorot merosh, as it says in the Navi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu called all generations out from the beginning. There's a direction to Maaseh Bereshit. And that is kind of how I use, perhaps as a more modern term, in terms of the powering of things, right? In other words, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running things, is powering things, is subsuming things, we're always finding a term to use, because we're always borrowing terms whenever it is that we talk about God. Because we can't really talk about God directly or within human terms in any way. So we do our best, right? And it's a question of kind of, how it is that we relate to the terms that matters. But there is a difference between that, the powering of a world and how it is that a world moves forward, and God's interest, attention, connection, care, right? So, with regards to the word indifference, I agree with the Rav that Hakadosh Baruch Hu is never indifferent to his world, right? It's his project, right? It's his engagement. But even when he says to us, as I mentioned earlier, you be indifferent to me, I'll be indifferent to you, that itself is an act of care, right? And it's saying, look, I'm going to act with you that way, yeah, is in itself in the context of a relationship, right? It's not Hakadosh Baruch Hu saying, well, I'm out. That he never says. Yeah,
What does
it's
it
that
mean practically?
say again.
What does it mean practically in terms of his
So
engagement?
it's like I said. I think like I said before, without getting into kind of an hour-long sheer on it, there is a sense of what it means to live a life without the personal, intimate connection with God in your life. It doesn't feel the same when there is that, right? So, question: what is that? Well, I mean, we can talk about it in many ways, right? So one of the ways is, yes, one does tend to feel, it could be said, certainly the Rambam says this, right, in the Moreh Nevuchim, that there's an element of haphazardness in where I am not the focal point of God's attention, but rather something in the backdrop of God's attention, right? And where things are going on in the world, but I may not be central in his mind, or at least I won't feel that way. You hear? So, and it's important that there is such a thing, because it cannot be that it is equal, right? That when one is living in full faithfulness and engagement and dedication and action in a relationship with God, that experience of life would be equal to one who doesn't do any of those things.
Mm.
It would actually be an aberration
Mm.
of the value of actually doing so.
Rabbi Friedman, I want to see your thoughts, particularly on that verse where God says, if you act haphazardly with me, I'll act haphazardly with you. How do you understand that? Particularly, one also might want to think about the fact that it may well be some Jews, particularly in the last few generations, may act haphazardly with God, perhaps through no fault of their own, perhaps because they just haven't been aware of God or been taught. And so would it really be fair for God to act in that way in those specific cases?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to describe God's indifference. I don't know. Imagine a parent, a mother feeding her child, spoon feeding her child. The child is completely unappreciative. He does not realize or understand the mother's investment. But if the mother stops feeding him, he'll scream. He wants the feeding. He doesn't appreciate the feelings behind it. So that really is not a question of divine providence. That's a question of free choice. So maybe we should have a discussion on what Bechira Chavshi means. In our free choice, we can either be appreciating our mother feeding us, or we can take it for granted.
But what does it mean God acts haphazardly with us? What would the parent be doing to the child?
Like the rabbi says, when God says, if you want to play tough, I can play tough with you, it is such a statement of love and commitment. Like a little story about the girl who thought God was angry at her. Now, the father called me and said, my daughter thinks God is angry at her. She's all depressed. So I speak to the girl and I say, God is angry at you? She says, yeah. I said, I'm so jealous. You're 12 years old and you can get God angry? When did you become so important? See, God never gets angry at a leaf or at a fish. So God is simply saying, look, we're going to have a relationship. Either it's going to be a loving relationship or it's going to be a tough relationship. But I'm not quitting on you. So go ahead. Make your move, and I'll engage the way you want to engage.
But what would it
So
mean that he's acting haphazardly?
when the miracles are concealed, when it seems like God is not there anymore, the Holocaust looks like God is dead in the relationship, even as he is running and controlling and making everything happen. That's the degree of freedom of choice we have. He can be feeding us and we deny it. Not because it's not like he used to feed us and we forgot. No, he's feeding us right now and we're saying there's no God. The chutzpah of it is is huge. So really, this is entering into the area of freedom of choice, and of course the big question of if there is already divine providence, Meirosh, God already planned it all out to begin with, then how do we have free choice? The Rambam doesn't really explain it. He says it's a mystery. But what how does that work? If you want to get into that, that's a little bit of off the topic.
I'm not against Judaism, I'm just against Zionism.
It's not Jewish, it's Zionism.
Judaism and Zionism are completely separate.
Judaism is a faith, Israel is a state.
You can be Jewish without being a Zionist.
Zionism and Judaism is totally diametrically opposed.
I'm sure you've heard this before, from protesters, from politicians, from even well-meaning people trying to navigate the Israel-Palestine debate. But I'm here to tell you that this separation is complete nonsense. It's a comfortable lie. The kind of lie that sounds intelligent but collapses the moment you actually open this book, the Torah, the Bible, and study Judaism on its own terms. In this JTV Plus documentary, we're going to tackle this myth head on. We'll actually look inside the Torah and see how in the very first book, Genesis, there's no mention of law or religion. It's all centered on the promise of a specific land to a specific nation. We'll trace how Judaism, not modern politics, but Judaism itself, is structured around one obsessive, relentless, undeniable claim: the land of Israel belongs to the Jews. We'll reveal why the building of a nation in the land of Israel is an indispensable part of the project of Judaism. Why Judaism is not a religion, it's the divine project of a nation in a land. We'll discover how the Torah preemptively answered the colonization accusation that wouldn't fully materialize for another 3,000 years. We'll explore why, if the land is so central, Jews had to spend thousands of years in global exile. We'll unpack what Zionism actually means, and how anti-Zionism doesn't just contradict Israeli policy, it contradicts the fundamental architecture of Judaism itself. For some people, this is going to be uncomfortable viewing, but by the end, we'll prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Judaism and Zionism are inseparable. To watch this JTV Plus documentary and access much more premium content, click on the link in the video description. We definitely should, although just in the interest of time, we might have to be a bit disciplined in how we go about each topic, and maybe that can be something we look at another time. But just one last thing I wanted to touch on in this particular subject is, okay, so just thinking more practically, going about our daily lives, when things happen to us, are we always entitled to say, there was definitely a reason for that, there's a purpose behind this, whether big or small? Rabbi Dwek.
I mean, of course we could say that. The question is, what do we mean when we say that? Right? Is it that it was a direct move on Hakadosh Baruch Hu's part to you in terms of his closeness and concern for what was going on, or was it part of the grand scheme of Hakadosh Baruch Hu's world, right? And you just happened to be in that, in that situation or that flow, whatever. There's no such thing as there is no purpose in terms of our understanding of God and his world. I think there's a different question as to, was this a direct attention towards me in my life, right? And so again,
How can we discern that?
Sorry?
How can we discern the two?
I think that the best way to discern it is to be honest about the nature of one's relationship with God. In the same way that you can be aware of the nature of your relationship with anyone that matters to you. How much are you putting into the relationship? How much are you giving yourself? How faithful are you? How involved, attentive, active are you in the relationship? That is an assessment that that of course Torah and Chazal regularly encourage us to take inventory of. And so there is something of a corollary there, right? And even that I say with caveat, because it is not this, we're not talking about black and white things. We're talking about human beings who are exceedingly complex. We're talking about human relationships which are exponentially complex, right? And it is impossible to take all of those details into consideration as a general presentation. But I do think that it is appropriate to consider that the nature of the interaction between God and a human being has a great deal to do with the nature of the human being's involvement with God, right? In other words, the level of faithfulness, the level of care, the level of attention and activity. That said, as I said before, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also a parent. So it's not, simply where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, well, if you do that, I'm going to do this. And, I'm going to act as a mirror to you, right? There are times where a parent needs to act with very tough love, where a parent needs not to respond to a child. And there are times where a parent really does need to come in and hold the child when the child just does not have the tools or the wherewithal, right, to be able to move ahead. And those are not easy decisions for human parents to make. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu engages with it in his infinite wisdom, it happens in tremendous nuance and sensitivity to the specifics of the individual and persons, right? So there's not a textbook in which we look and say, okay, I know that this is what it was. I think that what's important for a person to be sensitive to is how faithful is one's heart. And if
Right.
one's heart is faithful, then by all means, one should live a life believing and knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not just meeting you where you are, but one step ahead of you at where you are. God is always ready to take the relationship to the next level. The question is, are you ready to take the relationship to the next level? And so it's an inventory that I think is very much an inventory of one's own heart and one's own, and it's something that we would do well to regularly assess.
Right. Rabbi Friedman, same question to you.
Well, it's like, the most of the prophets bewail in God's voice, in God's name, the fact that he is devoted to us, he is taking care of us, he is loyal always, and we are not. Right? Most of the prophets say that. I carried you like a mother carries a child, and you are ungrateful. So again, that is a question of freedom of choice. How good are you at relationships? But he's definitely good at it. And he does not change, essentially. And if he's acting out of gvura instead of chesed, that's part of his devotion. Not a change in the devotion, just a change in method. So God is always saying, I'm loyal to you, I'm devoted to you, everything about you matters and I care, but you are so indifferent. Why are you doing that? But that doesn't have any bearing on divine providence. Divine providence means who runs the world. The relationship, that's a two-way street. God will not force his affection on us because that's not affection anymore. So there are really two things. The question was, can we always say about anything that ever happens to us, can we say God did this on purpose? Well, of course. He doesn't do anything mindless. Of course, it was on purpose. Because if it wasn't, it wouldn't happen. The question is God getting any pleasure out of this job of his? Or is his job becoming a little burdensome? That's the subtle part. That's the gray area of relationship. So God says, why is it I come and you're not there? I call you, you don't answer. So you're right. It is a kind of a one-way street where God is always there and we're kind of wandering about. We're into it at times, we're out of it, and but again, nothing can happen accidentally or incidentally. This is what the Baal Shem Tov added to the midrash of the fish in the ocean. The fact that the wind is blowing, everyone will agree, is divine providence. The wind can't blow by itself, right? So God sends his wind or sends his cold. That, of course, is divine providence. But once you have the divine providence of a wind blowing, and there happens to be a leaf on the ground, then of course the leaf is going to move because the wind is blowing it. That, the Baal Shem Tov said, is not correct. It's not like God is a victim of his own choices. Say, hey, you made the wind blow. What did you expect? The leaf is going to move. Too bad if you didn't intend it, but you let the wind go. So you kind of lost control when you released the wind. Of course not. So no matter how strong the wind is, if it's not the divine providence that the leaf should move, it wouldn't move. The wind does not determine. God determines the outcome of the wind blowing.
Right.
So the Baal Shem Tov was simply saying there is nothing that happens incidental to divine providence. Each individual result is divine providence. There's no piggyback.
Got it.
So can I attribute anything that happens to me as not coming directly from God? No. But what does directly mean, I think Rabbi Dwek would ask? What does it mean directly? It means he is the divine cause of it happening for a reason. The question is, does he enjoy this? A father playing with his child because he has to. Child needs attention. Is very different than a father playing with a child and loving it. Not sometimes, there are things that God does in creation that he does not love at all, like creating sin, creating suffering, creating exile. He does not relish it. He doesn't love it. It's almost like he does it against his own will because it's necessary for the purpose of the refinement of the world or the ultimate. So in a sense, God sacrifices for his creation and therefore is justified in asking us to sacrifice for it. He has Mesirat Nefesh, so he can ask us for having Mesirat Nefesh. I think that what Hasidus did is open up God's personal, let's even call it romantic feelings for discussion. Until Hasidus, that was taboo. Can't go there. Can't talk about, like you can't, when you're a child, you can't talk about your parents' relationship to each other. You just don't go there. Don't get into their intimate life. You have no business being there, right? So as we get further in history, more and more of God becomes available, and we're given permission to peek into the more personal side of God.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. It's great to see that there may well be the differences were much more pronounced in my mind when listening to both of you speaking than it actually turns out. So this has actually been so wonderful to hear the way you both address this issue, kind of be reconciled and understood in harmony. So that's terrific. I wonder if we'll be able to say the same thing of the second topic. Maybe, again, my interpretation of both of your approaches is more pronounced or less. Let's see. This is the topic of describing God. The language we use about God himself. The Torah speaks in terms that we can understand. God's hand, God's anger, God's remembering, his anger, his love. The question is what these words actually mean. Can we meaningfully describe God at all? Or does every description risk misunderstanding something fundamental? And again, I don't think this is just abstract. This shapes how we pray, how we connect to God, how we imagine and understand our relationship with God. Rabbi Dwek, do you want to start on this one? Hey guys, if you want to watch part 2 to this fascinating discussion, just click on the link below in the video description. Just quickly, we've all heard of heaven, hell, and the afterlife, and at some point I'm sure you've given it some thought. But the Jewish view is radically different from almost everything you've been taught. And once you hear it, it will change how you understand life itself. Have a watch of the trailer for our new JTV Plus documentary called Heaven, Hell, and the Afterlife, and you can watch the full film right now by clicking the link below in the video description. Across the world, the afterlife is described in simple terms. Heaven above, hell below, the devil waiting to tempt you, and a humanity born in original sin. But Judaism tells a story that is older, deeper, and far more hopeful. Less obsessed with fear and more rooted in purpose. A story where the soul is not born guilty, but born noble. Where the body is not the enemy, but the partner. Where the devil isn't God's rival, but his assistant, because Judaism has no second power. Where hell exists, but not forever. Where heaven exists, but not as the final destination. And where the real end of the human story is resurrection, not escape. Judaism views history as a mission, not a mistake. Other civilizations teach that we are here to earn our way into heaven. Judaism teaches that we are here to bring heaven down to earth. And to understand what happens after we die, we first have to understand why we're here in the first place. In this JTV Plus documentary, we're going to reveal the Jewish vision of life after death. One of the most misunderstood ideas, but if understood correctly, can transform your very understanding of life itself. To watch this JTV Plus documentary and access much more premium content, click on the link in the video description.